One thing that a lot of people know about the civil rights movement in the United States of America in the 1950s and 60s is that it was un movimiento pacífico. It was a mostly peaceful struggle, and that is mostly due to the philosophy of one of that movement's most famous leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King was a believer in a philosophy called nonviolent resistance, la resistencia pacífica. And in one way, that's a moral philosophy, meaning that Martin Luther King didn't believe that violence was a moral way to achieve one's goals. The ends, achieving freedom and equality for African Americans, would not justify the means if those means were violent. That's la filosofía moral de Martin Luther King Jr. However, on the other end, nonviolent resistance is also a strategy. Es una estrategia. Y tal vez estratégicamente superior a la violencia como un método lograr las metas del movimiento por los derechos civiles. That possibly strategically, nonviolence could be a superior method to achieving the goals of the civil rights movement, superior to violent methods. Now, this should be a little confusing because if you think about it, it's pretty easy to understand the reasons that nonviolent resistance is morally superior to violent resistance. Harming other people, killing other people, isn't something that most people think of as a moral action, even if the ends, equality and liberty for African Americans, are moral in and of themselves. But how can nonviolent resistance be strategically superior to violence? La violencia es una herramienta poderosa. Violence is a powerful tool. If I ask you nicely to do your homework, you're probably going to be less likely to do your homework than if I tell you that if you don't do your homework, some sort of violent punishment is going to await you when you arrive at school the next day. Violence and fear, la violencia y el miedo, these are powerful motivators. So how does it work that nonviolent resistance in the civil rights movement actually was not only morally superior, but strategically superior? No solamente moralmente superior, pero estratégicamente superior a la violencia. To understand that, we need to look at some examples. The first reason you can argue that nonviolent resistance is strategically superior to violent resistance is it complicates the response of authority. Take a look at this picture right here. This is a picture of a protest, a sit-in outside a drugstore in North Carolina, where some protesters are blocking the entrance to the store because this store serves whites only. This is a peaceful protest. The police have arrived, but the police are a little unsure of what to do. Now just imagine for a second that this was a violent protest, that these young protesters had seized control of the store, they had beaten down the racist employees of the store. That would be one way to protest segregation in this store. But it also makes the response of authority really easy. If the protesters are being violent, that gives the authorities an excuse to use violence against them. But when the protesters are acting peacefully, that limits the options of authority. At least if the authority has any kind of morality in and of itself, which usually when we think of police officers, we like to think that they do. So complicating the response of authority. La complicación a las reacciones de las autoridades es una manera que la no violencia es estratégicamente superior a la violencia. A second reason that it can be argued that nonviolent resistance was strategically superior to violent resistance during the civil rights movement, the protesters of the civil rights movement could not win a violent struggle. Take a look at this picture. This is a group of police officers ready to break up a civil rights protest. If that struggle turns violent, who do you think is going to win? Is it going to be the unarmed oppressed African American protesters and their allies? Or is it going to be the state police with guns and hoses and shields and a whole government behind them? I think the answer is pretty obvious. And so if you have a fight, a violent fight, una lucha violenta, entre ellos con poder y ellos sin poder, if you have a violent fight between one group that has power and one group that doesn't, un grupo que tiene armas y un grupo que no, pretty much every single time, the powerful group is going to win. And so violence in this case might have sent a strong message, but it would have ended up with a bunch of African American protesters in jail, beaten, or worse. The third way, and perhaps the most important way, that nonviolent resistance perhaps was superior, strategically speaking, to violent resistance in the civil rights movement, is its ability to win the hearts and minds of people around the country. Su habilidad ganar las corazones y los mentes de personas del país. Take a look at these pictures. These pictures are from the infamous march attempted by black protesters from Selma to Montgomery in the state of Alabama, trying to win their right to vote. These protesters were famously interrupted by Alabama police. The protesters did not respond violently, but the police did. Beat down the protesters on an infamous day called Bloody Sunday. This is one of those instances where police did not have the excuse to use violence. The protesters were being nonviolent, but the police decided to use violence anyway. Take a look at this picture specifically. This is a picture of a policeman ready to swing his club onto the head of a nonviolent African American protester. Think about what it was like for viewers who saw images like these from their televisions at home. Who's the bad guy? Who's the good guy? Whose side are you on? Now imagine this. Imagine that rather than this black man being on the ground, sheltering himself from a blow that's about to come, imagine he's on his feet, and imagine he has his fist cocked back and is ready to swing at the police officer. Imagine how different that image is perceived by people who are on the fence, white people at home in their living rooms, not in the deep south, up here in states like Minnesota, who are on the fence about this whole civil rights movement thing. The reason that nonviolent resistance was so powerful is because it clearly showed people who weren't in the midst of all this who were the good guys and who were the bad guys in this struggle for civil rights. Violent resistance couldn't do that. Violent resistance would have only reinforced all the negative stereotypes that white people already had of black people in the United States of America. But thanks to nonviolent resistance and images such as these, enough hearts and minds were won to gain a lot of civil rights victories. Your homework, tu tarea, is basically to show that you got something out of this video. It's to explain the philosophy of nonviolent resistance by Martin Luther King Jr. It's to explain how nonviolent resistance was not only morally, but perhaps strategically superior to violent resistance. And it's to give some examples. I gave you some here. Protestas no violentas, protestas pacíficas, peaceful protests of the civil rights movement. But you're studying a lot of other protests too this week. The Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, the Children's March, the lunch counter sit-ins. All of these are options of examples that you can use in the essay for today. And also that's a reminder to keep working on those civil rights timelines, because those are due Friday. I'll be back tomorrow with some more stuff about Martin Luther King and one of his main rivals and also allies in the fight for civil rights. Until then, nos vemos.